Hey guys, tonight we're heading back into the smoke-filled corridors of Manhattan's courthouses, where the walls were too thick for daylight and the files never stayed in one drawer for long. Picture this: a young man in a sharp wool coat, not yet 30, standing in a courtroom with a half smirk and a stare that could file its own injunction. He doesn't blink much, doesn't flinch either. The reporters don't know whether to applaud or run. The man is Roy Cohn. And while he's not the judge, he might as well be. You might think lawyers just argue cases. Roy? He negotiated power. He rearranged it. Sometimes he lit a match to it. And the paper trail he left behind? It wasn't filed alphabetically. It was filed strategically. Some say he was brilliant. Others say he was dangerous. But either way, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in his office. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere unexpected, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far we reach across the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first time Roy Cohn steps into a federal courtroom, he isn't holding a brief. He's holding the room. It's 1948. Manhattan is still wearing the post-war years like a fitted trench coat, worn at the shoulders, tight at the wrists. Veterans come home. Judges grow older. The law still runs on cigars and respectability, and Roy, barely past law school, walks in like he owns it. He doesn't just present arguments, he choreographs them. The clerk watches him from the corner, scribbling notes. Not about the case, about the man. Roy is young, hungry, and already infamous inside whispers that float across New York's legal community. Some call him the Boy Wonder. Others use terms like snake in a silk tie. But nobody ignores him. His voice, nasal, clipped, and confident, cuts through even the oldest oak-paneled chambers. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't wait his turn. He thrives in chaos. Historical fact? He graduated from Columbia Law School at 20. You heard that right. Barely old enough to drink, already licensed to tear someone's life apart in a courtroom. His mother, Dora, had pushed him. Pushed so hard, in fact, that people often joked Roy had a Harvard education before he learned how to tie his shoes. His father, a judge himself, taught him how to wield the law like a blade, not a shield. You have to picture it. Lower Manhattan, 1940s. The courthouses smell of damp paper and wet wool. The bailiffs sip bad coffee. Outside, trolley bells still ring, and the streets are lined with men in fedoras pretending not to notice each other. Inside, Roy Cohn is rising fast. Not because he's the most moral, but because he's the most memorable. Some say it was in his eyes. Cold, sharp, unreadable. Others say it was in his paperwork. Always filed, always organized, but never quite revealing everything. He argued like he was peeling wallpaper off a wall no one wanted to admit was rotting underneath. Judges started requesting him. Prosecutors started dreading him. The press? They just followed the trail of friction. And let's not forget the time he defended a government official accused of espionage. Still wet behind the ears, Roy managed to inject doubt, twist statements, and cast shadows where none existed. The case didn't matter. The impression did. Afterward, someone whispered, "That kid's gonna get someone executed one day." Many people still think that if Cohn hadn't walked into that courthouse at such a young age, the trajectory of American legal intimidation, yes, that's a phrase, might have looked very different. So what do you think? Was it raw talent or rawer ambition? What we do know is this. Roy Cohn didn't just win cases. He kept them, as in the files, the memos, the notes no one else saved. Even back then, he understood the future would be written by the ones who kept receipts. You remember what we said about the files, right? They start here, in a drawer barely big enough for a few folders. But by the time we reach the end of this journey, well, let's just say that drawer is going to need its own legal team. He walks out of that courthouse with his first major win and a half dozen new enemies. And the city? It tilts slightly in his direction. The whisper networks expand. Judges mention him over dinner. Secretaries lock filing cabinets when he enters the building. One defense attorney even jokes, "If I ever see that kid across from me again, I'm taking the stairs and pretending I forgot my briefcase." Roy doesn't laugh, he just makes a note. That's how it begins. Not with fireworks, not with scandal, but with a young man standing in a courtroom, cataloging everyone's weaknesses like he's collecting stamps. And by the end of that year, more than one lawyer in Manhattan is looking over their shoulder and wondering what Roy Cohn is doing with all those files. Bronx mornings aren't known for being gentle. The trains rattle before the sun finds its stride, and the buildings, with their chipped brick and reluctant warmth, seem to exhale the sighs of last night's arguments. That's where Roy Marcus Cohn is born, on February 20th, 1927. Not exactly into struggle, but certainly within earshot of it. His childhood isn't spent dodging hardship like many in his borough. In fact, the Cohn household is a fortress of comfort, complete with a housekeeper, a chauffeur, and a mother who treats Roy less like a son and more like a lifelong project. Dora Marcus Cohn is ambitious, iron-willed, and determined to shape Roy into something that will command every room he enters. Picture a Broadway director, but the stage is her son's future. Every piano lesson, every elocution drill, every social connection, they're all brushstrokes on her masterpiece. Roy's father, Albert Cohn, is a respected judge, quiet, intelligent, and rarely the one steering the family's emotional ship. That's Dora's job. Roy, for his part, doesn't push back. He adapts early, learns to read the room, reads people faster than books. His favorite game? Winning at adult conversations. By 8, he's reciting political jokes. By 10, he's listening in on his father's phone calls and memorizing case names like baseball stats. The Cohns host dinners with state senators and appellate court justices, and Roy becomes the unofficial maitre d' of ambition. He doesn't speak unless it's strategic, and even then, he times it like a chess move. His school teachers describe him as brilliant, if a little manipulative. His classmates just call him weirdly confident. He finishes high school years ahead of schedule, not because he loves school, but because it's the next step toward the courtroom he's already been daydreaming about. Mainstream historical fact? Roy enrolls at Columbia University at age 16 and completes both his undergraduate and law degrees by 20. Let that settle in. 20 years old and already a licensed attorney in New York. If you're picturing textbooks and all-nighters, you're off. Roy isn't the coffee-fueled, hunched-over-the-library kind. He coasts through lectures, charms professors, and turns every essay into a tactical operation. Still, there's a shadow following him, even then. He rarely mentions friends, doesn't bring people home, keeps secrets like heirlooms. Some classmates say he seemed older than his age. Others just call him impossible to read. He's the kid who always knows the test answers, and somehow also knows your father's profession and your mother's maiden name. And in his quiet moments, which are rare, Roy watches his father at the courthouse, not in admiration, but in analysis. How he moves, how he wins, how he files paperwork with a certain rhythm. He begins to copy it, not out of love, but because power, even silent power, is worth replicating. There's a story that floats around Columbia's campus during Roy's final year. A professor assigns a paper on judicial ethics. Roy submits a case analysis so pointed, so cynical, that the professor calls him into his office, not to reprimand him, but to ask, "Is this how you really see the system?" Roy shrugs. Only the parts that work. Many people still think that Roy's legal instincts were less about law and more about leverage. So what do you think? Was he a prodigy of the system? Or just the first to treat it like a game he could cheat better than anyone? By graduation, he's not celebrating. He's planning. He already has connections in the DA's office. Already has lunch meetings with judges who shouldn't be lunching with recent grads. And already has folders, yes, folders, on professors, classmates, and even one faculty dean. They say it's all legal research. But those who know Roy suspect it's something else entirely. There's this one night, the summer before his first trial, when Roy walks the streets of Manhattan alone. He stands outside a courthouse at 2 a.m., watching the janitor mop the floor behind the glass doors, not moving, not speaking, just watching. Like he's casing the building not for theft, but for possibility. He doesn't go to parties. He doesn't date. His circle is tight, controlled, and mostly composed of people who owe him favors. At 21, he looks 40 in the right light, and that's just how he wants it. He starts attending small legal mixers, always showing up overdressed and undersmiling. His reputation spreads in whispers. That kid Cohn? He doesn't blink. And that becomes his signature. Never the loudest in the room, but always the one you remember after the lights go out. It's around this time that Roy begins documenting everything. Notes on conversations, copies of letters, carbon duplicates of anything he ever signed. One colleague jokes, Roy could blackmail half the city and still have enough paperwork left to wallpaper his office. It's meant as a joke, but no one laughs too hard. Dora watches with pride, of course. She sees her creation unfolding exactly as planned. Albert, the father, remains distant, offering the occasional nod of approval, but never quite stepping into the picture. Roy doesn't mind. Affection was never the currency they dealt in. Then comes his bar exam, passed on the first try. No drama, no delays, and no celebration dinner. Instead, Roy files for access to a series of closed court records, just to study precedent, he claims. But one judge notes the names on the files requested, all politically connected, all conveniently useful. And just like that, Roy Cohn is an attorney in New York, not just on paper, but in posture, presence, and ambition. The city doesn't know it yet, but something cold and calculated has joined its bloodstream. At 22, Roy isn't building a career. He's building leverage. The law, to him, isn't justice. It's language. And Roy Cohn is already fluent. There's a certain audacity to being a lawyer before you're old enough to rent a car. At 17, most kids are worrying about prom dates or acne flare-ups. Roy Cohn, on the other hand, is halfway through law school, already memorizing courtroom procedures and scouting which judges smile too much. He's attending Columbia Law, but you'd be mistaken to think of him as a student in the traditional sense. Roy doesn't debate in study groups or bond with classmates over lunch. He circles people like case studies, quietly evaluating their weaknesses, jotting mental notes like footnotes he might one day subpoena. Professors admire him but don't invite him for coffee. He corrects their hypotheticals in class, not rudely, just efficiently, with the air of someone who knows the statute by memory and the loophole by instinct. By his third semester, Roy starts visiting courtrooms between classes, not as a requirement, just watching, learning. He doesn't sit in the back. He perches near the front like a hawk in a tailored blazer, hands folded, eyes flicking back and forth as lawyers fumble or stammer. When the court breaks for lunch, Roy sometimes lingers by the doors, scribbling on index cards. One bailiff says, "Kid looked like he was already filing appeals in his head. This isn't just schooling, this is infiltration. Historical fact? By 1949, Cohn has passed the New York State Bar and is working as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District at 22. That office, by the way, is no slouch. It's the kind of legal jungle where even experienced lawyers hesitate. And Cohn walks in like he already owns the marble floors. His first real assignments are menial: wire fraud, small-time racketeering, forged bonds. But Roy doesn't treat them like small potatoes. He uses every case as a stage. A federal clerk recalls how Roy once cross-examined a counterfeiter with such precision that the defendant offered to plea before the defense even got a word in. He made grown men fold, the clerk says. And he hadn't even grown a full beard yet. Around this time, Roy starts wearing suits that look too expensive for his title. And maybe they are. Some say his mother still funds his wardrobe. Others suspect private backers, older lawyers hoping to buy early influence. But Roy never clarifies. If asked, he just smiles and says, "I invest in presentation." Many people still think that Roy's early courtroom aggression was performative, even reckless. But others argue it was surgical, an early indication of how he'd later weaponize theater in service of control. So, what do you think? Was he just another young gun in love with the sound of his own voice? Or was he already scripting the next act before the curtain even rose? Then comes the moment that shifts the course of everything. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American citizens accused of espionage and passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. A trial drenched in paranoia, propaganda, and political pressure. Roy, just 23, campaigns to be placed on the case. Not assigned, campaigns. He wants it, badly. No one quite knows how he gets in. Some say he impresses his superiors with a memo so articulate, so venomous, that they give him a seat at the prosecution table out of sheer curiosity. Others whisper that Cohn pulled strings his age shouldn't have reached. Favor calls from higher offices, backroom deals greased with ambition, and maybe a little fear. Either way, he's in. A junior prosecutor, sure, but loud, visible, and disturbingly persuasive. He argues aggressively, objects often, stares directly at jurors like he's daring them to flinch. The headlines start mentioning his name, not as a footnote, but as a personality. And when the Rosenbergs are convicted and sentenced to death, Roy celebrates quietly, but deliberately. Not with champagne, but with a phone call to his mother. "We did it," he reportedly says. Let's be honest. There are still debates raging about Roy's role in the Rosenberg execution. Officially, he wasn't the lead prosecutor. But unofficially, many believe Roy's behind-the-scenes pressure, particularly his private chats with the judge, influenced the outcome more than any closing argument. So what do you think? Was he simply playing his part? Or did he push too hard for a verdict that would define him? Back in the office, he starts keeping folders. Not official files. These are personal, clipped articles, photographs, transcripts, notes, and yes, rumors. He files away every piece of gossip with the same care as legal precedent. A colleague once joked that Roy didn't need a secretary, he needed an archivist. And then there's the question of how a kid in his early 20s gets invited to closed-door meetings with federal judges. The coffee room whispers get louder. Roy's access seems unnatural, too smooth, too soon. He shrugs it off, says he's just efficient. There's even one dinner party, hosted by a prominent senator, where Roy is the youngest guest by 20 years. He arrives wearing a navy three-piece and holding a thin leather portfolio. The senator jokes, "Roy probably brought notes on us all." The room laughs. Roy does not. As the Rosenberg fallout continues, Roy uses the notoriety to build relationships. He visits Washington more often, joins committees, starts making friends with people who really don't like communists. One of them? A certain senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy, but that's coming. For now, Roy Cohn is still the wunderkind of the Manhattan legal elite. Young, ruthless, and already addicted to the kind of power that doesn't come with a nameplate, but with silence. And at night, when the lights are out, he sits in his modest apartment, sorting through clippings, case files, and names. Always names. Names that will come in handy. The courtroom is humid, overloaded with press, and humming with the kind of tension that doesn't need permission to enter. This is the Rosenberg trial, America's most radioactive legal spectacle of the Cold War era. The year is 1951. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg sit at the defense table, accused of conspiracy to commit espionage, and somewhere between the district attorney and the jury box sits a young, nearly unknown prosecutor whose name will soon be synonymous with ruthless ambition. Roy Cohn. He's just 23. Barely a footnote in the Department of Justice's hierarchy. But he's not behaving like it. He's not just a body at the table. He's a presence. You can feel it even in the press clippings. Roy's tie is always a little tighter, his tone a little sharper. He cross-examines with the kind of precision most lawyers don't develop until their hair's turned gray. The lead prosecutor is Irving Sapol, but Roy doesn't act like second chair. In fact, he keeps nudging the spotlight. He files motions like a man in a hurry. He's said to have lobbied for the death penalty with private conversations and memos written so forcefully that even seasoned judges paused. There are reports, unverified, whispered, that Cohn spoke directly with Judge Irving Kaufman outside of chambers, that he argued the Rosenbergs' actions warranted capital punishment not just for justice, but for message. America was in a red panic, and Roy Cohn wanted to be the one delivering the anti-communist headline. Historical fact. The Rosenbergs were indeed sentenced to death and executed in 1953. The case remains one of the most controversial in American legal history. Even today, historians argue about the degree of guilt and the proportionality of punishment. But one thing they rarely debate: Roy Cohn's fervor. He wasn't assigned this case. He positioned himself into it. He'd later brag, on record, that it was his behind-the-scenes push that convinced Judge Kaufman to impose the electric chair. "I made the recommendation," he said with cool finality. "I don't regret it." Many people still think that if Roy Cohn hadn't involved himself so directly, the Rosenbergs may have received life sentences. So, what do you think? Was it ambition masquerading as justice, or justice corrupted by ambition? Either way, it worked. The trial makes national headlines. Roy's face lands in newspapers. His name becomes a shorthand for anti-communist legal zeal. And just like that, he transitions from assistant U.S. attorney to political lightning rod. Behind the scenes, Roy Cohn is thrilled. Her son, the pride of her carefully sculpted ambition, is now the most famous prosecutor in the country. She boasts about him to neighbors, to shop clerks, to anyone who will listen. Roy barely acknowledges the praise. He's already planning the next move. And then, like a cue from offstage, the phone rings. On the other end, Senator Joseph McCarthy's office. They're building a legal team for a new anti-communist crusade, congressional hearings, federal investigations. Roy's name keeps coming up. It turns out, he's developed a reputation not just for prosecution, but for bloodless focus, for knowing which legal buttons to push and when to twist them. He's summoned to D.C. for a meeting. The moment he arrives, people take note. He's still in his 20s, but he walks like someone used to being followed. The staffers around McCarthy are mostly older, gruffer men, veterans of the bureaucracy. Roy stands out. He's younger, sharper, dressed better, and he never fidgets. McCarthy interviews him personally. They talk for hours, not just about communists, but about optics, headlines, how to phrase a question in a way that sinks like a dagger and echoes like thunder. Roy doesn't just speak fluently, he thinks in strategy, and McCarthy is sold. There's a brief hiccup, though. J. Edgar Hoover, the iron-lunged director of the FBI, prefers another candidate. David Shine, a wealthy, photogenic, anti-communist crusader and friend of Roy's. McCarthy considers hiring both, which he does. Now, Roy Cohn and David Shine are working side by side on Capitol Hill under the banner of McCarthyism. They're the new faces of the Red Scare, and their friendship, some call it suspiciously close, others just unusual, becomes a focus of gossip, both whispered and printed. Roy doesn't flinch. If anything, he leans in. He starts building dossiers, not just on suspected communists, but on journalists, politicians, and even fellow prosecutors. His filing cabinet at this point? Already too full. He orders more. People start calling him McCarthy's pit bull, but the metaphor doesn't quite land. Roy doesn't bark. He doesn't snarl. He smiles while slipping in the knife. One reporter describes him as the quietest storm in the room. Another says, if you see Roy Cohn smile during testimony, someone's reputation is about to bleed out. He begins accompanying McCarthy on televised hearings. When McCarthy throws the punch, Cohn is the one loading the glove. The duo terrifies bureaucrats, terrifies academics, terrifies Hollywood. Careers fall, reputations shatter, all in the name of rooting out communist influence. The newspapers eat it up, and in between all of it, Roy keeps collecting. Notes, names, secrets, half-truths, insurance policies in manila envelopes. You'd think someone that young, that visible, would trip eventually. But Roy doesn't stumble. Not yet. He thrives on the high wire. Every hearing is another performance. Every witness, a stepping stone. Every journalist, a potential enemy, or a future quote machine. It's not about law anymore. It's about leverage, and no one's better at holding it than Roy Cohn. There's a quiet but deliberate rhythm to Capitol Hill. Floorboards that groan like old men, ceilings that echo whispers longer than applause. And into that rhythm walks Roy Cohn, freshly installed as chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy. He's not elected, not even technically senior in his position, but somehow everyone knows he's the one holding the fuse box. Washington in the early 1950s is paranoid, theatrical, and dripping in Cold War dread. Files disappear, phones click mid-conversation, and names are always being added to lists that no one wants to admit exist. Roy doesn't just thrive in this climate, he manufactures the weather. His schedule becomes a thing of legend. Breakfast meetings with informants, morning hearings with trembling witnesses, lunchtime calls with J. Edgar Hoover's office, and afternoon strategy sessions with McCarthy himself. By nightfall, he's poring over files and hotel suites and tapping out notes with gloves on, just in case someone's planted a print-sensitive bug on his typewriter. People joke that Roy Cohn doesn't sleep, but maybe it's not a joke. A staffer once saw him reviewing documents under lamplight at 3 a.m. and asked if he ever went home. Roy looked up and said, "Only if there's a reason, historical fact." Cohn and McCarthy's crusade led to over 2,000 government employees losing their jobs, many without formal charges, just suspicion. Some were accused of communist affiliations. Others were targeted for being gay. These weren't isolated prosecutions. This was systemic purging, fueled by Roy's mastery of innuendo over evidence. That's where the so-called Lavender Scare comes in. While the Red Scare targeted political ideology, the Lavender Scare targeted sexual identity. Roy, ironically, is rumored to be gay himself. The hypocrisy is so thick it could be bottled and sold, but Roy never addresses it. Not publicly, not even privately. He walks through it all like a man made of fog and Kevlar. There's a photo from this era, grainy, black and white. Roy sits behind McCarthy during a hearing, half smiling, with his hands folded and his eyes tracking something just out of frame. It's not clear what he sees. Maybe a nervous witness. Maybe a shifting alliance. Maybe just the next headline. His influence grows fast and loud. Senators call him for advice they wouldn't ask their own chiefs of staff. Reporters quote him anonymously and nervously. Even Hoover, the man who prefers puppets to partners, keeps Roy on speed dial. They don't always trust each other, but they're useful to one another. And in Washington, that's better than trust. It's during this era that Roy starts collecting more than secrets. He collects favors. You need a judge reassigned? Roy knows who to call. Need a journalist silenced? Roy knows which columnists have skeletons with headlines attached. Need an actor blacklisted? Roy already has the memo typed and ready. But then comes David Schein, a handsome, wealthy, anti-communist pamphleteer who somehow becomes Roy's inseparable companion. They travel together, dine together, check into hotels under aliases. The gossip mills start churning. Reporters whisper. Senators grow uneasy. The intimacy between Roy and Schein doesn't go unnoticed. And McCarthy, who depends on optics more than outcomes, starts to feel the tremors. When the army refuses to give Schein a cushy post, Roy goes to war. Literally. He threatens. He leverages. He tries to strong-arm the Pentagon into assigning Schein wherever Roy wants. It's a personal crusade disguised as a professional battle, and it becomes the very thing that undoes everything. This is what leads to the Army McCarthy hearings, a live televised showdown in 1954 that peels the paint off the entire operation. Suddenly, America isn't watching Roy and McCarthy prosecute others. They're watching them get prosecuted by senators, journalists, and their own hubris. And here's where it turns. Joseph Welch, the Army's lead counsel, delivers the infamous line that severs Roy's public image like a guillotine. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency? It's directed at McCarthy, but Roy's sitting inches away. He flinches, maybe for the first time in public. Many people still think that moment ended McCarthyism more than any policy change or executive order. So what do you think? Was it just a soundbite with good lighting? Or did America really catch its breath and say, enough? After that, things crumble fast. McCarthy's star dims. Roy's name becomes toxic outside certain circles. The headlines shift from awe to scorn. He isn't fired, technically. He just isn't invited back. Back in New York, Roy pivots hard. Reinvention is his native language. He takes on private legal clients, some of them shady, others just desperate. He leases a modest office and starts filling it with the old habits: folders, contacts, secrets. But the DC glint in his eye? It never really fades. He keeps the photos, keeps the files, keeps the Rolodex coded. And if anyone asks about the hearings, he says the same thing every time. We were doing what had to be done. No apology, no regret. Just a low chuckle and a look that says, "You weren't there. I was." And somewhere in a locked drawer, Roy still has the Shine correspondence. Still sealed, still private. Because even after decency made its plea, Roy Cohn never let go of the files. It's late 1954. Washington no longer returns his calls. The spotlight he once bathed in now casts only heat, and Roy Cohn, former wunderkind of the Red Scare, is back in New York, pacing the floor of a new office that smells like fresh carpet and desperation. But don't think for a second that he's broken. Roy doesn't do broken. He does re-entry. The Manhattan legal world is skeptical. He's still young, barely pushing 30, but already carrying the kind of baggage most men only accumulate after 2 divorces and a federal indictment. His name is toxic in Washington, polarizing in New York, and whispered like a curse in Hollywood. And yet, the phone still rings. The people calling aren't looking for morality. They're looking for protection. Cohn opens his own private practice. Technically modest, but positioned with ruthless precision. Midtown, near the courthouses. Close to the press, not far from the power brokers. He decorates the space with restraint. Sleek furniture, heavy drapes, and a file cabinet taller than most interns. Clients don't come for the ambiance. They come for the edge. One of the first to visit? A name that'll later haunt the headlines: Paul Castellano, the future boss of the Gambino crime family, back when he's still consolidating power and playing nice. Roy doesn't blink. He doesn't judge. He listens, nods once, and writes nothing down. That's the first rule of this new chapter. Keep the real notes off the record. Soon, the client list evolves like a Darwinian parade of New York's least lawful. There's Carmine Galante's cousin with real estate problems. There's an associate of Anthony Fat Tony Salerno who needs tax help. And there's even a Broadway producer who wants to bury a lawsuit beneath a fog of procedural nonsense. And Roy, ever the technician, handles it all. He's not cheap. His retainer starts high and climbs steadily. But clients don't pay for paperwork. They pay for results. For outcomes no one else can promise. For the kind of courtroom sleight of hand that turns damning evidence into technical error, or gets entire depositions retracted under mysterious procedural clauses. Historical fact. Throughout the late 50s and 60s, Roy Cohn represented numerous organized crime figures while publicly denying any such associations. His legal maneuvering helped delay or derail countless investigations into mob-linked figures, most notably those tied to the Genovese and Gambino families. Many people still think that Roy was more than a lawyer to these men, that he was a consigliere in all but name. So what do you think? Was Roy simply offering legal advice, or shaping outcomes that even the 5 families couldn't engineer on their own? His methods remain opaque. Some lawyers use briefs. Roy uses fear, not threats, never overtly, but implications. He files countersuits with such precision that opposing counsel thinks twice before speaking to the press. He drops hints about people's pasts, not accusations, just reminders. Things they might have forgotten he knew. He builds a Rolodex that reads like a modern American tapestry of ambition and menace. Politicians, bankers, editors, loan sharks, DAs, private investigators, ex-lovers of senators. He doesn't discriminate, only accumulates. One contact at a time, one lever closer to the switch. His office hours become fluid. He meets clients at odd times, early mornings before indictments drop, or past midnight in private rooms at the 21 Club. He prefers red wine, but always keeps a coffee pot on the desk. For effect, mostly. There's a scene, now urban legend, where Roy negotiates 2 settlements at once, one over the phone with a judge, the other across the room with a bookie turned business partner. Neither man knows the other is on the line. Roy juggles both, smiles, ends each call with "much appreciated," and hangs up without notes. One of his secretaries once joked, Roy doesn't file documents, he files people. And indeed, his system is strange but effective. Instead of case summaries, he keeps handwritten notes on personality types, insecurities, tells. He understands people more than precedent. He knows when to press, when to pull back, and when to delay just long enough to let someone else lose their nerve first. He builds a reputation for being impossible to intimidate. FBI agents start avoiding interviews where Roy is present. Judges grow nervous when he walks into court without a briefcase, because that means he doesn't need one. He also learns to manipulate the press. Carefully. He develops relationships with certain columnists, feeding them stories when it suits him, leaking half-truths that keep his enemies defensive, and the public unsure of which version of Roy to believe. One journalist writes, Cohn operates like a rumor with legal stationery. He relishes that quote, and yet there's always something just beneath the surface. Attention. Roy doesn't trust easily. He hires staff in layers, rarely letting anyone access the full picture. He keeps multiple safes, encrypts his phone calls with analog tricks, never lets a visitor sit where they can see his notes. It's around this time that Roy also begins crafting his myth. He tells people stories about his time with McCarthy, some true, others embellished. He drops names in passing, mentions favors he's done for a certain senator or a certain newspaper editor. Always vague, always effective. If someone doubts him, he shrugs. You're welcome to try it your way. They never do. Clients love him. Judges tolerate him. Opponents hate him. And Roy just adds them all to the files. The lobby of Roy Cohn's Midtown office becomes a kind of theater. People sit in silence, pretending not to notice each other. A union boss with a pending indictment leafs through a 2-day-old newspaper. A socialite with a slander case fiddles with her sunglasses. And then there's the mobster. No name, just a gold pinky ring and a cigarette he won't light until he's out of sight. Roy keeps them waiting just long enough to remind them who holds the clock. Inside, his office is a war room of silence and velvet. There's the faint tick of an antique clock, the smell of espresso, and file cabinets that may or may not be alphabetized, depending on what kind of leverage the day requires. He meets clients with a calm that unsettles them. There's no small talk. Just a glance that says, "You called me." Not the other way around. By the early 60s, Roy Cohn has become a lawyer of last resort. He's not the guy you hire when you want a fair trial. He's the guy you call when fairness is no longer the goal, just survival. His clientele spans the social spectrum. On Tuesday, he's advising a mob-connected trucking company on how to avoid union scrutiny. By Thursday, He's drafting cease and desist letters for a television host caught in a defamation scandal. The weekends? Reserved for brunches where senators whisper favors and Broadway producers share their financial sins between mimosas. Roy doesn't blink. He never does. He thrives in contradiction, representing mob bosses while casually advising anti-corruption committees, hosting cocktail parties where judges and felons breathe the same air, both wondering who Roy's really loyal to. The answer, of course, is neither. He's loyal to leverage, historical fact. During the 1960s and 70s, Roy Cohn represented a staggering array of clients, including Carmine Galante, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Francis Cardinal Spellman, and even Studio 54's co-owners. Each came to him for different reasons, but all left knowing that Roy's loyalty wasn't personal. It was transactional. He becomes known for what insiders call strategic dirt banking. He stores away details, not always illegal, but always damaging. A mistress here, an offshore account there, a falsified resume, a bribe that didn't go through clean. Nothing immediate, just potential. He files it, keeps it, waits, sometimes for years. One assistant swears that Roy had a file labeled just in case. No client name, no case number, just clippings, photographs, handwritten notes in blue ink. She asked about it once. He replied, "Everyone's got something. Some just haven't remembered yet." This is also the era when Roy's lifestyle becomes harder to ignore. He's seen dining with fashion designers, laughing too long in the company of beautiful young men, slipping into Manhattan's more private nightclubs after hours. The whispers about his sexuality grow louder, but they never seem to touch him. He jokes about rumors with the same tone he uses to dismiss subpoenas, bored, amused, and faintly threatening. He dates women publicly, appears at galas with actresses on his arm, but it all feels performative, curated like his tailored suits. The truth, whatever it is, stays sealed behind that signature grin. David Shine is long out of the picture. Married now, a businessman. But Roy still keeps his photograph in a drawer, under a stack of legal memos. No explanation, no label, just memory, preserved like evidence. Many people still think that Roy's refusal to come out, even as others did, wasn't just fear, it was strategy. So what do you think? Was his silence about self-preservation, or a cold calculation to keep power's grip unbroken? Because in Roy's world, vulnerability is a liability. Even the way he talks has changed. Gone are the clipped legalisms. Now he speaks in phrases that sound like lines from a noir screenplay. You can't lose if the jury doesn't understand. Or, delay is just a quiet kind of victory. These phrases spread, repeated by associates and clients like gospel. There's another, one that sticks more than the rest. I don't want to win. I want the other guy to wish he'd never started. And he means it. Roy begins hosting private dinners in his apartment, just a few guests at a time. Wine, classical music, laughter. Then, inevitably, the topic turns to someone not in the room. A judge's temper, a reporter's hidden past, a senator's wife's secret vacation. He says these things softly, like bedtime stories, and the table leans in every time. It's around this point that he stops just being a lawyer. He becomes something else. Not a mobster, not a politician, but a broker of favors, of silence, of delay. One former client said, "Roy doesn't break the law. He just makes it walk in circles until it forgets where it started." And still, the files grow. Another cabinet appears in his office, then another. Some marked with initials, others just symbols. He jokes that if the FBI ever raids his place, they'll need lunch and a nap halfway through. What they don't know is that half the files aren't about his clients. They're about other people's. He keeps tabs on prosecutors he's never met, judges he's never argued before, journalists who've never written about him, but might. It's not paranoia, it's preparation, because in Roy's world, the most powerful document isn't a verdict. It's a file no one knows you have. A courtroom can be many things: stage, confessional, battlefield. But when Roy Cohn walks into one, it becomes something else entirely. A demonstration, not of justice, but of control. By the mid-1970s, Roy is no longer the boy wonder. His hair thins, his voice rasps a little harder, and the lines around his eyes carve deeper. But don't let the appearance fool you. His sharpness hasn't dulled. If anything, he's meaner, quicker, less patient with the niceties of legal theater. Judges recognize him before he speaks. Opposing counsel often comes armed with backup: co-counsel, paralegals, sometimes prayer. One federal prosecutor says, "You don't argue against Roy, you survive him." And Roy? He leans into that image like it's bespoke. His suits are tailored tighter, his posture more relaxed, like a man who knows he's already won before court is called to session. His legal briefs are unusually short, but filed early, the way assassins send flowers before the funeral. Historical fact: in 1973, Cohn represented the owners of the New York Cosmos soccer team in a dispute that drew national attention. The case itself was forgettable. What wasn't forgettable was how Roy maneuvered around discovery rules, withheld critical documents with legal sleight of hand, and still managed to settle on terms favorable to his client. The judge reportedly shook his head and said, "Only Roy could do that without technically lying." Many people still think Roy's genius wasn't in knowing the law. It was in knowing how slowly the law moved, and how easily you could outpace it with the right kind of pressure. So, what do you think? Was it brilliance? Or just a man who saw the courtroom as a poorly run casino? This is also the era when Roy begins using lawsuits as weapons, not defense, not even offense, deterrence. A journalist pokes into a client's finances? File a libel suit. A former employee threatens to testify? File a breach of contract motion. With such vague language, it could mean anything. A rival lawyer starts circling? Roy files 2 suits, one real, one just to clog their calendar. This strategy, eventually dubbed papering, becomes his trademark. He doesn't need to win, he just needs to exhaust you, drown you, make sure you're too broke or too weary to keep fighting. He even admits this once, in a lowball voice across a Manhattan dinner table. "Litigation's not about who's right," he says. "It's about who lasts longer without blinking." The people sitting with him nod, but they don't laugh. Around this same time, Roy begins cultivating what can only be described as a double clientele. On one hand, the mobsters, Castellano, Salerno, Galante's surviving lieutenants. On the other hand, the Manhattan elite, real estate developers, art dealers, CEOs, each side pretending the other doesn't exist. And Roy? He plays concierge between their worlds. He introduces a builder to a union negotiator with known mob ties. He helps a media executive settle with a labor board official whose uncle once served time for racketeering. Roy doesn't view it as criminal. He views it as connective. A legal ecosystem built not on innocence, but on compliance. The irony is that he's becoming too powerful to prosecute, too entangled. One investigator comments, "You could indict Roy Cohn, but half the city would have to take the stand, and the other half would plead the fifth. By now, his office has become almost mythical. The two doors, one for clients, one for others. The multiple safes, some rumored to contain nothing but handwritten blackmail notes. The windows, always curtained. The phone line, always tapped. Sometimes by Roy himself, he begins burning certain documents after reading them. Not because they're incriminating, just because he wants people to wonder what they said. Power to Roy is 30% leverage and 70% ambiguity. He starts showing up in court less often, but when he does, the impact is volcanic. He speaks with a low, dismissive confidence, interrupts sparingly, but always to reframe the narrative. One day, after being told a judge may rule against his client, Roy leans back in his chair and says, "That would be unfortunate for the judge. The judge rules in his favor. Of course, not everyone's enchanted." The legal establishment starts murmuring about disciplinary action. Ethics complaints pile up like unpaid parking tickets. Bar investigators request interviews. Roy ignores most of them. When they show up at his office unannounced, he invites them in, offers espresso, and says absolutely nothing of value. One complaint reads, "Mr. Cohn appears to have no understanding of the distinction between legal advocacy and organized manipulation." He frames that letter, puts it behind his desk. Many people still think Roy survived so long in the legal world, not because he played fair, but because he never played by the same rules twice. So, what do you think? Was he immune to accountability? Or did the system just prefer its monsters well-dressed? His clients still adore him. Why wouldn't they? Roy doesn't promise innocence. He promises protection, and he delivers. Even when indictments come down, even when RICO charges loom, even when informants flip, Roy somehow finds the procedural loophole, the sympathetic judge, the lost affidavit. It's not always clean, but it's effective. And if someone pushes back too hard, Roy has one more trick. The whisper campaign. He'll never threaten, never write it down. But suddenly, a journalist gets a call about your tax issue from 10 years ago, or a councilman hears about your affair, or your daughter's private school receives a suspicious letter questioning your financial integrity. None of it traceable, all of it possible, because the files don't lie. The year is 1978, and Manhattan is humming like it always does. Horns, heels, and headlines. But inside the paneled quiet of Roy Cohn's office, the noise sounds different. It's not the city that's changing. It's Roy. He still moves with the confidence of a man who's never apologized. Still shows up to court in handmade suits. Still makes waiters nervous with how little he blinks. But there's a shift now. One only visible if you know where to look. The lines around his mouth tighten. He takes more calls from Palm Beach. He skips a few hearings, not because he's slowing down, but because he's reallocating energy. Enemies whisper that he's losing his grip. They don't say it twice. Roy still has files. Too many files. And even the people rooting for his fall know better than to throw the first stone. But it's here, in this late 70s twilight, that Roy begins something new. A deeper obsession with settling scores, not through court rulings, not through verdicts, but through erasure. Silence. Humiliation. A former client who sues him finds that every phone number they used to call no longer works. A rival attorney suddenly faces an anonymous tax audit. A political columnist who questioned Roy's ethics loses a syndication deal and never knows why. Roy's fingerprints are nowhere near it, and that's the point. He starts referring to this practice as cleaning the files. His phrase, not legalese. It doesn't mean deleting them. It means making sure what's inside them is still sharp enough to bleed if ever needed. Historical fact? In the late 1970s, Roy Cohn was still officially practicing law, but the New York Bar Association had begun compiling ethics complaints against him, alleging misconduct, conflict of interest, even witness tampering. He dismissed it all as politics. In public, in private, he added the investigators' names to his files. Many people still think that, by this point, Roy's entire practice functioned more like a private intelligence agency than a law firm. So what do you think? Was he still a lawyer, or something more elemental? Because here's the thing. Roy doesn't just remember your mistakes. He remembers your fears. He keeps notes on who blushes when asked about their college days, who hesitates when asked about cash payments, who stares too long at a courtroom ceiling when asked if they've ever been involved in anything gray. He files those moments, just as valuable as any signed affidavit. Around this time, his circle narrows. Fewer big parties, more quiet dinners. The guest list changes. Fewer artists, more developers. Fewer mobsters, more men who own pieces of Midtown and still need someone to manage the occasional scandal. And then there's the new face, a brash, ambitious, self-promoting real estate developer who's turning downtown buildings into glossy headlines. A young man with too much press and too little polish. His name? Donald Trump. They meet through mutual acquaintances, some say at a benefit, others at the racket club. But however it starts, Roy takes a liking to him, not for his mind, but for his malleability. Roy sees something in Trump, a willingness to fight dirty and a hunger for image over substance. It reminds him of someone, himself maybe, or a younger, less cautious version of the power he once chased. Trump, for his part, is odd. Here's Roy Cohn, mob lawyer, power broker, courtroom magician, and he wants to represent him. What Roy offers is more than legal advice. He offers strategy, a playbook on how to weaponize lawsuits as deterrents, how to manage the press like a chessboard, and how to never, ever admit fault. It's less mentorship and more construction, brick by brick. Roy helps build a persona that can't be punctured by facts. They become inseparable in public. Charity galas, ribbon cuttings, power luncheons. Roy is no longer the man whispering in senators' ears. Now, he's whispering into a future that doesn't even know it owes him. And yet, he never lets Trump too close. No one gets too close. Because Roy, even as he teaches, keeps his own files on everyone, including the protégés. One former colleague finds a folder in Roy's cabinet labeled DT. It includes press clippings, building permits, tax notes. Not illegal, just comprehensive. When asked about it, Roy shrugs and says, "You never know when someone will forget they owe you something." It's around this time that his enemies resurface. Some wear robes, bar association officials, now emboldened by mounting complaints. Others wear suits, former clients looking to clean up their own reputations by cutting ties. But Roy has one more move, visibility. He starts appearing on TV more, accepts interviews, plays up the eccentricities. He becomes a character, part villain, part myth. And in doing so, he makes himself harder to kill. You can disbar a lawyer. You can't cancel a persona. Still, the walls begin to lean. Courtrooms get less friendly. Judges sigh more when his name appears on the docket. Opposing counsel stop recoiling in fear. They start preparing harder. And in rare, flickering moments, usually when the office is empty and the city lights paint his windows gold, Roy sits at his desk, hand resting on a half-drunk glass, and looks at the file cabinet across the room. He's won a lot, lost just as much, but in that moment, he knows the only real victory he ever trusted was possession of secrets, of silence, of files. The first ethics complaint comes wrapped in the polite language of bureaucratic discipline, but Roy Cohn sees it for what it is, a threat dressed in a necktie. The year is 1980, and the New York State Bar Association is sharpening its knives. They say Roy's conduct is unbecoming, that he's violated professional standards, that he's compromised the integrity of the legal profession. Roy laughs, out loud, then circles 3 names on the complaint and makes a phone call, because for Roy, this isn't a trial. It's a negotiation. Everything is. By now, his office has grown darker, not metaphorically, but literally. The curtains stay drawn longer. The lighting is dimmer. Visitors enter through different doors, depending on what kind of business they're doing. It feels less like a law firm and more like a bunker. And the files? They've become territorial. Each drawer has its own hierarchy. Names with dates, events with cross-referenced keywords. There's a whole cabinet just labeled insurance. He jokes that it has better coverage than Blue Cross, but the complaints keep coming. Historical fact. Between 1980 and 1985, Roy Cohn faced repeated disciplinary investigations by the New York legal system, including charges of unethical behavior, intimidation tactics, conflict of interest, and falsifying documents. He fought everyone, not by addressing the substance, but by attacking the process, filing counterclaims, suing the Bar Association, alleging political bias, distracting, delaying, denying. His strategy is classic Roy. Don't fight the charge, fight the accuser. He appears on TV interviews to say the complaints are persecution, orchestrated by liberals and jealous colleagues. He smirks when asked about ethics, says, "I sleep very well," and ends the segment with a wink so rehearsed it might as well be copyrighted. He hires publicists instead of paralegals, writes op-eds, speaks at banquets. He doubles down on being Roy Cohn, the man who doesn't blink, but cracks begin to show. Clients still come, but some now request side entrances. Others ask their names not be included on invoices. Judges start ruling against him more frequently. The press stops treating him like a curiosity and starts treating him like a relic, and still he refuses to adjust. He taunts the bar investigators. One arrives at his office with a subpoena. Roy has him wait outside for 40 minutes, then appears in a bathrobe holding a martini glass filled with coffee. "I wasn't expecting guests," he says flatly. They exchange tense words. Roy offers no cooperation, just commentary. And beneath it all, that ever-present implication: I have files. Do you really want to keep pushing? Many people still think that Roy could have avoided disbarment if he'd just played nice. So, what do you think? Was he cornered? Or was he daring the system to prove it could finish the job? The answer creeps closer in 1984, when formal proceedings begin. Roy represents himself, of course. No one else can speak for him. Not really. He treats the hearing like another courtroom stage. He questions witnesses with disdain, cross-examines judges mid-ruling, mocks the clerks. It's theater, but this time it doesn't work. One former colleague says, Roy thought he could outwit gravity, but even he couldn't argue his way out of gravity's paperwork. Meanwhile, something else is happening behind the scenes. Something Roy doesn't talk about. Not even with his closest allies. He's getting sick. At first, it's fatigue. Then night sweats. Then sudden weight loss. He brushes it off, tells people he's just overworked, that the stress of fighting the bar is catching up to him. that he's fine. But the truth is that Roy is living in denial. Loud denial. Because admitting illness would mean admitting weakness, and weakness is the one thing Roy has never allowed, not even in private. Historical fact? Roy Cohn was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, but publicly insisted he was suffering from liver cancer. He refused to acknowledge the disease, even as it advanced, even as the symptoms grew too obvious to mask. He still makes appearances, still hosts dinners. But now there's a new urgency to the way he talks, a sharper bite to his jokes, a thinner curtain between performance and panic, and still the files remain untouched. One night, a longtime secretary finds him in his office long after midnight. He's sitting at his desk, flipping slowly through a folder labeled Legacy. It's not legal paperwork, just newspaper clippings, photos, a few yellowed cocktail napkins with dates scribbled on them. He doesn't say anything, just closes the file and says, "Make sure no one ever finds this drawer after I'm gone." She nods, doesn't ask which drawer. The disbarment comes in 1986. Official, public. The New York Supreme Court states that Roy Cohn has been found guilty of unethical, unprofessional conduct and is no longer permitted to practice law. He dismisses the ruling, tells reporters, "Who needs a bar license anyway?" But it hits harder than he lets on. For a man who spent a life spinning power from silence, being formally silenced is a wound he can't bandage. Many think it's poetic justice. Others call it too little, too late. And Roy? He files the court notice away, not in a trash bin, in a drawer labeled Resolved. Summer in New York City can feel like a fever that never quite breaks. By 1986, Roy Cohn walks the streets of Manhattan like a man who's daring the weather to match him. He's paler now, thinner, but he still dresses like a courtroom is only 10 steps away, still nods curtly to doormen, still orders lunch like the waiter owes him an answer. But the world is tilting. Not rapidly, not violently, just enough that Roy can feel it. The disbarment should have ended him. For most lawyers, it would be a professional obituary. But Roy never saw the law as a career. It was always a tool. And you don't stop being dangerous just because someone takes your name off the door. What does change, though, is the access. The invitations slow. The press stops calling. A few clients still slip in through side entrances, but others vanish entirely, moved on, replaced, or simply unwilling to be seen with someone who no longer holds official weight. Roy responds the only way he knows how, by doubling down. He keeps the office open, keeps the staff on payroll, keeps dressing like an indictment is just around the corner, and he plans to greet it with a toast. But behind closed doors, the symptoms are harder to ignore. Fatigue creeps in like a draft under a locked door. His suits don't fit the way they used to. A cough lingers too long. Historical fact? In the final months of his life, Roy Cohn continued denying he had AIDS, telling reporters, friends, and even doctors that he was battling liver cancer. It was a deliberate fiction, one he never broke, even as the evidence consumed him. And still, the phone rings. Donald Trump still calls, seeking advice, seeking reassurance. Roy obliges. He always does. There's a strange pride in watching the young man he once mentored rise. But there's also a quiet irritation. Roy never wanted to be remembered as someone else's stepping stone. He wanted the whole staircase. He spends more time at home now, in his apartment lined with mirrors and marble. It's a space designed to feel expensive, not comforting. Even his bed looks like it's judging you. One night, A friend finds him staring at a wall of framed photographs. McCarthy, Shine, Hoover, Trump. No labels, just ghosts. "What are you thinking?" the friend asks. Roy doesn't answer, just lifts a glass and says, "Most of them owed me more than they gave." He still hosts dinners, though now the crowds are smaller. The conversation's quieter. No more war stories. No more legal puzzles to unravel over dessert. Just long silences and the occasional story told in half sentences, like he's preserving oxygen. The files remain locked, unopened, untouched. Some staff whisper that he started forgetting what's in them. Others say he knows exactly what's inside, but no longer sees a reason to open them. The leverage, after all, only works if you plan to use it. And Roy? He's finally running out of time. One evening, he pulls a file from the back of a drawer. It's labeled in his own handwriting, but the paper is curling with age. Inside, letters, unsigned, typed, just fragments of thoughts, confessions that read more like exercises than admissions. In one, he writes, "They mistook my silence for emptiness. It was always calculation." He burns it in a metal trash bin by the window, watches the ash swirl up toward the city lights. Many people still think Roy's refusal to acknowledge his illness wasn't about shame, but about narrative control. So, what do you think? Was it dignity, or a final act of denial scripted for no one but himself? In the spring of 1986, his health crashes. He's hospitalized, still refusing the label, still demanding tailored pajamas, still correcting the phrasing of doctors who ask too many questions. Journalists hover like vultures, hoping for a quote. He offers none, just a look that still contains fragments of the boy who once argued federal law before he could legally rent a car. Historical fact? Roy Cohn died on August 2, 1986, at the age of 59. The official cause of death was complications related to AIDS, though his obituary, at his insistence, listed liver cancer. His funeral is quiet by his standards. No press circus, no dramatic last statements, a few faces from the old days, some nods, some silence. Donald Trump does not attend, but somewhere, locked away, are the files, still sealed, still unnamed, still full of things that no one has ever said out loud. And that's the last trick Roy Cohn ever pulled. He made silence speak louder than confession. Death, for most, is a closing act. But for Roy Cohn, it was more like a curtain call no one was quite sure had ended. After his passing, the world didn't go quiet. It leaned in. There were rumors, of course. Whispers in law offices and at Upper East Side brunches. What would happen to the files? Who had the keys? Did anyone even know how many copies he'd made? The mystery didn't fade. It just metastasized. His office was sealed within hours of his death. A legal formality, they said. Inventory. Closure. But for those who knew Roy best, it felt less like a closing and more like the first step in a very careful reallocation of secrets. One clerk, a junior associate who'd only worked with Roy during the last 18 months, was said to have spent 3 straight days inside the office cataloging papers. When he emerged, pale and visibly shaken, he said nothing. Just quit the firm and moved to California. Some of the files were removed by court order, others by unknown hands. Because Roy didn't just keep files. He layered them, duplicated them, moved them. Safe deposit boxes, private vaults, anonymous P.O. boxes. Some say he mailed copies to himself under aliases. Others insist he used his late-night club connections to stash the more radioactive folders inside private archives that required 2 keys and a confession to access. Historical fact? After Roy's death, federal investigators and the New York Bar attempted to retrieve his case files. Many were incomplete or misfiled. Several were simply missing. One file, rumored, never confirmed, was labeled Judicial Assets, Do Not Touch. It reportedly listed judges, their rulings, personal scandals, and donation patterns going back 3 decades. No one has ever seen it. Some believe it was destroyed. Others think it's still out there, somewhere, behind a false drawer or under someone else's name. And then there was the G file. Allegedly, a master folder with details on Roy's most high-profile connections. Gambino, Galante, Giuliani, even G-men at the Bureau. Again, no proof, just whispers. Which is exactly how Roy would have wanted it. His apartment, when cleaned out, revealed strange relics. A cocktail napkin with a Supreme Court justice's name scrawled in blue ink. A black and white photo of Joseph McCarthy, unsigned but creased in the corner, like it had been studied more than once. A handwritten list of names under the heading, If I Go Down First. No context, no dates, just names. Many people still think that Roy's final victory wasn't avoiding consequences, but outlasting relevance, remaining a threat even from the grave. So what do you think? Is it paranoia to believe someone like that could still haunt the system? Or just realism in a city built on memory and misdirection? Donald Trump, his protege, offers only a single statement to the press after Roy's death. He was a good lawyer to me. He did what he had to do. No memorial, no flowers. Just that. Others stay even quieter. Former clients pretend they never hired him. Judges insist they ruled against him more than for him. Journalists suddenly forget his number. The silence isn't grief, it's self-preservation. And yet, Roy's name continues to surface. In books, in TV specials, in the half-smirk of lawyers who've read about him but never met him. In the way some real estate lawsuits still cite tactics he helped popularize. In every subpoena written just a little more aggressively than necessary. In the phrase, you need a Roy Cohn. Because even in death, Roy remains useful. Some say his ghost still lingers at 39 East 68th Street. Not as a spirit, but as a legacy. In the structure of old case files. In the hush of hallways once walked with purpose. In the safes no one has dared to drill open. In the quiet dread that something might still surface. His former secretary once said, "I wouldn't open his last drawer if you paid me." When asked why, she replied, "Because Roy never kept anything without a reason. And some reasons aren't meant to be rediscovered. And in a city where forgetting is an art, Roy Cohn engineered a different kind of memory. One that doesn't fade. It waits. Because maybe his greatest creation wasn't a case or a headline or a conviction. Maybe it was the idea that there's always one more file. And maybe, just maybe, that file has your name on it. By 1987, Roy Cohn was dead. But no one could quite agree on what that meant. The obituary writers did their best to summarize him. Controversial attorney, McCarthy's right-hand man, New York power broker. But none of those titles fit like they should. They were accurate, yes, but incomplete. Roy had never been just one thing. He was a collection of contradictions, stitched together with ambition and sharpened by paranoia. In the weeks after his death, friends and enemies alike walked more carefully, not because they missed him, but because they weren't entirely sure he was gone. Not in the spiritual sense, in the practical one. What had he left behind? Who now had the files? The legal community murmured. The Bar Association released a cold, perfunctory statement about ethics and consequences. But the real drama played out in whispers, over long lunches, through anonymous phone calls, and behind closed conference room doors. And then came the leaks, small at first. A memo from the 70s that surfaced in an unrelated real estate case. A photograph from a private meeting no one remembered attending. A typed letter referencing a favor owed, with Roy's name in the margins and a coffee stain darkening the signature line. These weren't bombshells. They were reminders. Roy's presence, his technique, lingered. He had built his life like a tripwire, easy to forget, until you stumbled over something you didn't know he'd touched. One of the most telling examples happened that fall, when a sitting judge suddenly recused himself from a mob-related RICO case. No explanation. Just a memo to the court, followed by a quiet, early retirement. 2 weeks later, someone found a scribbled note in an old legal pad at Roy's office. J, 1968, Shore Club, envelope, kept copy. That was it. No surname, no detail. But enough, apparently, to move a man off the bench. Historical fact? Though never proven, several legal historians believe Roy Cohn's private files contained sensitive material on numerous public figures, some of which may still exist in private hands or untraceable collections. In at least 2 separate civil cases posthumously linked to Roy's clients, judges were forced to consider sealed evidence no one could trace back to any current attorney of record. Many people still think that Roy engineered his legacy not around cases, but around consequences. So what do you think? Was his influence posthumous, or just paused? The Trump connection, of course, didn't vanish. Donald kept rising, building towers, making headlines, wading into controversy with the same brazenness Roy once taught him to wield like armor. And though he rarely invoked Roy's name publicly, his tactics screamed their origin. Delay everything, deny everything, never concede. Privately, Trump was said to mention Roy only in passing. He was tough, he'd say, or he knew how to win. But those who were there during their rise together knew the truth. Roy hadn't just been Trump's lawyer. He'd been his blueprint, and yet, Roy's other protégés, the shadow clients, the whisper networks, the half-forgotten players in his ecosystem, faded more quickly. Some disappeared entirely. Others re-emerged, quieter, grayer, still using fragments of Roy's playbook, but leaving his name off the cover. Back at his former office, the landlord changed the locks and re-leased the space within 6 months. A new tenant moved in. They redecorated, painted the walls, tore out the old file cabinets. But late one evening, during light renovations, a contractor found something odd. Behind a false wall panel, no larger than a bread box, was a single metal box. Inside, a dictation tape, a faded photo of a senator mid-handshake with an unidentified man, and a legal pad with one phrase written over and over again in Roy's unmistakable blue ink. Memory is leverage. It wasn't made public. It never made the news. But the building superintendent, who saw the box briefly, resigned the next day. Even the new tenants asked for extra locks on the windows, just in case. There's a strange sort of comfort in forgetting, in believing that someone like Roy Cohn is gone, permanently. But there's discomfort, too, in the feeling that he may have planned even this, that somewhere, in a law library or private archive, another file might surface. One last envelope. One final name. Because Roy didn't leave a memoir. He left a threat. Unfinished, unspoken, and possibly still waiting to be opened. And maybe that's what makes his story so peculiar. Not the trials, not the scandals, not even the disbarment, but the fact that even now we're still whispering, still wondering, still turning over pages he may have planted. And in a way, maybe that was his real legacy all along. The New York legal community has always had a short memory, except when it doesn't. And with Roy Cohn, forgetting is harder than anyone cares to admit. Not because he left behind a monument, or because his victories were so grand, but because he operated like a watermark, subtle, invisible, until held to the right light, and then suddenly everywhere. In the years after his death, something strange happens. His name, once a punchline or cautionary tale, becomes a reference. Not in law school textbooks, though occasionally professors will drop a knowing nod when discussing the limits of advocacy. No, his name reappears in darker corners, behind whispered legal strategies, in the phrasing of suspiciously aggressive defamation suits, and in the defensive shrug of political consultants who say, well, that's just how it's done now. Cohn's methods live on, even if no one wants to say it out loud. And no method is more enduring than the file strategy. It resurfaces in surprising places. A lobbying firm mysteriously acquires sealed deposition excerpts. A senator's office mysteriously walks back a statement after a quiet phone call. A tabloid receives a story about a rival publisher and buries it, not because it isn't juicy, but because of who delivered it. Each time someone says, feels like something Roy would have done, but there's never proof, just implication, which, as Roy always knew, is better. Historical fact? In the decades following Roy Cohn's death, several of his former clients and associates went on to hold prominent positions in media, law, and politics, some adopting strategies remarkably similar to those Roy perfected. Preemptive lawsuits, media manipulation, calculated intimidation. No one ever claimed the playbook, but the fingerprints? They're unmistakable. One former assistant, now retired and living quietly in Connecticut, was once asked if Roy had trained people. He didn't train, she said. He infected. You didn't realize you were learning until you were doing it the way he would have done it. And perhaps the most curious legacy of all, the unconfirmed file drops. Beginning in the late 80s and continuing into the 90s, anonymous documents began appearing in legal cases tangentially related to Roy's former clients. Judges would receive unmarked manila envelopes containing photos, letters, or internal memos. Sometimes they arrived before critical motions. Sometimes they showed up right before a settlement conference. None were signed. None were verified. All bore the same quiet signature: fear. Many people still think those files were planted long before Roy's death, set on a timer, or handed off to trusted allies with instructions. So what do you think? Was it coincidence? Or Roy, reaching out from the past with the timing of a conductor still directing the orchestra? In the city, his name becomes folklore. Bartenders at old midtown spots tell stories about the table he always sat at, the one by the window, with the view of the courthouse. Taxi drivers recall picking him up late at night, always alone, always with a black leather folder on his lap. A tailor in Hell's Kitchen keeps a dusty measuring form with Roy's name at the top. Still talks about the man who never slouched even when he coughed blood. But it's not just memory, it's atmosphere. Certain rooms still carry his shadow. Legal circles mention him without explanation. People talk about pulling a Roy when they mean digging up something you shouldn't know. Law firms still joke, half seriously, about hiring a Cohn type when a case starts to get complicated. And it's not just in the law. In politics, his fingerprints remain smudged on the underside of ambition. Public figures denounce enemies with sweeping, evidence-light accusations. Lawsuits become press releases. The public forgets what truth is supposed to sound like. Somewhere, Roy would be smiling. Because Roy never cared about truth. He cared about narrative, and in that realm he remains undefeated. Somewhere, in the vast quiet of a private archive, there's probably still a drawer with his name on it. Or maybe not. Maybe that's just the fear he designed, alive and whispering long after he's gone. A fear not of what's in the files, but of the possibility of them. That was his trick, wasn't it? You didn't need to open the drawer. You just had to know it existed. By the early 1990s, Roy Cohn had been dead for half a decade. And yet, in certain corners of Manhattan, he was still showing up. Not in person, of course, but in stories that felt suspiciously fresh. A misfiled document here, a legal maneuver copied word for word there, a judge's sudden recusal, a journalist's abrupt change of tone. Whispers, again. He'd always said it. Silence is currency. The more you save, the richer you become. But now, that silence started to hum. Not with new scandals, but with an absence. The kind of absence that suggests not closure, but a pending second act. You see, Roy didn't just influence people. He reformatted them. Those who worked with him, who studied him, feared him, borrowed from him, carried parts of his style forward without even realizing. They filed things differently, wrote emails like cross-examinations, took meetings like chess games. Even their pauses felt calculated. The ripple wasn't just legal, it was cultural, historical fact. Roy Cohn's legacy has been cited, directly or otherwise, by countless lawyers, political operatives, and journalists. His deny, deflect, delay method has become a playbook not just for defense, but for domination. Lawsuits filed not to win, but to punish. Investigations weaponized for leverage. Press releases as legal threats. These tactics, refined in his heyday, became institutionalized long after his disbarment and death. And somewhere in that haze, the files began surfacing again. Not all at once, just enough to stir the myth. A judge who ruled favorably in a key zoning case suddenly resigns. An old Broadway producer is indicted on financial crimes, and a letter bearing Roy's signature is entered into evidence. A document from 1975 marked "Do Not Copy" ends up in a federal investigation into banking fraud. Every time people wonder, did Roy plan this? Every time, the answer is the same. He probably didn't have to. He just left enough breadcrumbs. You remember the file marked "Legacy," right? The one he burned? Maybe there were more. Maybe that was just the one he didn't want anyone else to interpret. But others? He could have scattered them like seeds, each one waiting for the right season to bloom. Even his old office, long since released, holds its own peculiar presence. Tenants report doors that won't quite close. A small alcove where no light bulb ever seems to work. A cabinet in the basement, bolted shut, that maintenance refuses to open without legal permission. Superstition? Maybe. But this is Manhattan. People believe in ghosts, especially when those ghosts kept receipts. Many people still think Roy's enduring presence isn't in the documents he left behind, but in the doubt he created. So, what do you think? Was the real legacy physical or psychological? Because even now, people measure risk with a Roy Cohn ruler. They ask themselves before pressing send, what would Roy do? Would he delay? Redirect? Send a handwritten note to a judge's brother-in-law with a reminder about that one time in 1964? His tactics weren't limited to law. They became life strategies. How to argue, how to pivot, how to win by outlasting. And perhaps the strangest piece of all, the way he still appears in unlikely places. One night in 1994, a late-night producer claims she received an anonymous package, no return address. Inside, a cassette tape, a recording, muffled, hard to hear, of a voice she swore was Roy's, rehearsing closing arguments, not for a real case, for a conversation, a monologue meant for no one, or maybe for everyone. She never played it for the public, just stored it in a safety deposit box and quietly moved to Chicago. Then there's the hotel story. A bellhop in Midtown claims he once helped an elderly man load a briefcase into a waiting car. The man tipped well, but said nothing. Days later, someone recognized the briefcase. A rare make, custom monogrammed, RMC. Supposedly, only one set was ever made. The man, never identified. The briefcase, vanished. And yet, even with these stories, there's no closure. Roy made sure of that, because the files weren't just about leverage. They were layers, protection, prophecy, threat, memory. They were everything he couldn't say out loud, and everything he didn't need to. And so we arrive at the close of this chapter, where Roy Cohn is no longer a man, or even a legacy. He is an echo, the kind you hear in an empty courtroom, the kind that makes you hesitate before deleting that email, the kind that reminds you just for a second that somewhere, somehow, someone might still be keeping notes. Now, if your eyes are getting heavier and your mind a little slower, that's no accident. Let's drift away from the noise, the marble hallways, the cross-examinations, the flickering headlines. Picture instead a desk, not large, just tidy, a leather blotter, a silver pen, a half-drunk scotch, no phone ringing, no one interrupting, just silence. Outside, Manhattan is asleep. The city's breath has slowed, and the names, those countless names in countless folders, have gone quiet too. Not erased, just resting. Maybe you hear paper turning, maybe you don't. Either way, nothing's urgent now. The files can wait, and so can you. Just close your eyes. There's nothing more to read tonight. The silence that followed Roy Cohn's death didn't last long. Silence, after all, was never Roy's natural state. It was just his weapon. And those who inherited his tactics didn't let them gather dust. As the 1990s unfolded, the legal world began mutating. Subtly, then rapidly. Corporate lawsuits no longer felt like legal matters. They felt like wars. Media scandals began appearing with such surgical timing that one couldn't help but feel there was choreography behind the chaos. And in the middle of it all, lawyers were acting less like counselors and more like generals. Some of them never met Roy, but you could tell who had studied him. The term Cohnism quietly entered backroom legal vocabulary. It didn't mean representing the mob or making noise on Capitol Hill. It meant knowing when to move, and more importantly, when to make someone else move. It meant shifting pressure points until the building leaned your way. One high-profile attorney was overheard saying, "Roy didn't beat the system, he rerouted it, one motion at a time." Meanwhile, in New York, the quiet reemergence of Roy's name happened in the most unexpected place: real estate. Developers who had once whispered with him in the corners of cocktail parties now wielded lawsuits like zoning permits. Eminent domain arguments surfaced overnight. Permits disappeared. Political donations aligned like chess pieces. And somewhere in the background, a familiar strategy played out. Delay, deny, dominate. Donald Trump, Roy's most high-profile protege, had taken those lessons and exploded them across the skyline, not just in towers, but in courtrooms. Reporters noticed, biographers too. Every time he sued a contractor, delayed a subpoena, or attacked a journalist in public, someone would write, "Sounds like Roy." Historical fact. Trump, after Cohn's death, would go on to hire other lawyers, but none earned his loyalty the way Roy had. When once asked in an interview why he admired Cohn so much, Trump replied, "Because he would do anything. He got things done." That quote was clipped, archived, and filed. Somewhere, someone probably put it in a folder and labeled it posthumous influence, because Roy wasn't just missed, he was mirrored. But not all echoes are flattering. As Cohn's methods spread, so too did the corrosion. The legal system, already burdened, became bogged down with retaliatory lawsuits. Frivolous became the new strategy. Filing became a threat. Depositions were less about truth and more about intimidation. The courtroom became a stage for narrative, not resolution. Roy had planted those seeds. Now the garden was overgrown. Many people still think Roy's influence poisoned the water more than it quenched any thirst for justice. So what do you think? Was he a genius ahead of his time? Or just the architect of a slower, quieter collapse? Then, something strange. Old files began to surface at auction, not from his office, not directly, but items linked to cases he once touched. A typewritten note on his letterhead. A deposition transcript with his annotations in the margins. Just a few words, blue ink, underlined once. Never admit. Shift. Return fire. Historians got involved. Legal scholars too. One law journal published a retrospective titled The Cohn Doctrine, Weaponizing Process. It was dry reading, but buried in the footnotes was a single sentence that stood out. Cohn may not have been the most ethical attorney of the 20th century, but he was certainly the most instructional, and that, in some ways, was his immortality. Not the name, the method. In quiet corners of Midtown, older lawyers still tell young associates, "Don't bring me facts, bring me leverage." It's a line Roy never officially wrote down, but one he might have engraved somewhere, just deep enough to last. Then there was the matter of the final folder. A collector, anonymous, claimed to have acquired a Roy Cohn file through a third-party estate sale. No one verified the chain of custody. The contents? Never published. But the description alone raised eyebrows. One handwritten letter, unsigned. One copy of a 1962 wiretap transcript. One photograph of 3 men, 2 of them now deceased, seated at a restaurant known for hosting private legal dinners. The collector never came forward. And maybe that was the point, because Roy's power didn't come from the contents of his files. It came from the idea that someone, somewhere, might open one tomorrow. One judge put it best. Cohn's real legacy is uncertainty. No one knows what he had, so everyone acts like he still might have it. And so, even now, decades on, Roy's specter isn't just a memory. It's a management style, a philosophy, an operating system coded into power's most insecure corners. He once said, offhandedly, during a deposition, "The truth is just one version. The timing is what matters." That quote never made it into any law textbook, but somewhere in a room full of closed doors and locked drawers, it's framed, under glass, waiting. New York changes, but some ghosts keep their corner offices. By the turn of the millennium, Roy Cohn had been gone nearly 15 years, and yet his style, his peculiar mix of charm, venom, and litigation as blood sport, was more alive than ever. Not in name, but in execution. You could feel it in certain cases. The language used, the timing of leaks, the way subpoenas arrived just hours after rumors started spinning in the press. None of it traced to Roy, of course. But every veteran lawyer who saw it knew exactly what they were looking at. Roy wasn't just studied, he was replicated, and in some cases reverse engineered. Because as more time passed, younger attorneys, ones who had only heard his name in hushed tones, began to investigate. Not his biography, not his ideology, but his methods. His tactics were dissected like wartime strategy. Never file first, file second and harder. Keep 3 versions of everything. One for court, one for leverage, and one just in case the first two disappear. Speak softly in public, but never forget who owes you favors behind the curtain. Historical fact? In the early 2000s, several high-profile legal training programs, off the record of course, began including case studies based on Cohn's most notorious maneuvers, stripped of names but unmistakable in structure. A whole generation of litigators learned how to weaponize depositions, delay justice through redundancy, and use media pressure as a pretrial tactic. It wasn't law, it was legal choreography, and Roy had written the original score. Meanwhile, the ripple effect widened. Cases that once might have settled quietly now exploded across headlines. Politicians adopted litigation not as a shield, but as a sword. CEOs sued critics not to win, but to exhaust them. And behind it all, you could hear Roy's voice. Not literally, but in the pacing, in the script. At a downtown law firm, a junior associate coined the term Cohn fog, when opposing counsel's strategy becomes so layered with ambiguity, misdirection, and last-minute filings that the truth becomes irrelevant. One senior partner just laughed and said, "Fog's generous. Roy brought smoke." Still, not everyone was using his tactics with precision. Some misunderstood his intent. Roy didn't believe in chaos for its own sake. He believed in control through narrative. You don't bury facts, you obscure them behind louder facts. You don't destroy your enemy, you keep them standing, just quiet enough to be useful. Which is why, when a billionaire tech mogul launched simultaneous lawsuits against 3 former partners, each in a different state, each timed to interrupt key business transactions, one journalist covering the case wrote, "It's not that he's using Roy Cohn's tactics. It's that he thinks he understands them. And that's more dangerous." Because here's the thing. Roy's style wasn't scalable. It was custom-fitted, built for a city that ran on elevators, martinis, and fear. In the wrong hands, his approach crumbles. Too blunt, it looks like bullying. Too cautious, it collapses under its own weight. Many people still think the true heirs to Roy's influence aren't the loudest, richest, or even the most controversial. They're the ones you never notice, the quiet fixers, the men and women who never go on camera, but always have someone on speed dial. So what do you think? Is his ghost visible in public flameouts, or in the smooth silences behind unexpected victories? Then came the strange little auction. It didn't make the front page, barely made the back. Just a local estate sale in Westchester. Among the items, old legal pads, office memorabilia, and a sealed envelope marked Personal Effects, RMC. It sold for $110. The buyer, an archivist and collector, opened it privately. Inside, a typed letter with no signature, a business card from Studio 54's co-owner, and a single sheet of yellowed paper with this scribbled note. Call if they threaten to talk. Remind him of what we know about room 11. No context, no explanation. But if you knew Roy, it was perfect. A story with no beginning, no end, just implication. That's the thing about Roy's legacy. It's never loud, it's lingering, and the city still reacts to it. A former appellate judge, long since retired, once said during a private lecture, "Roy didn't haunt the courthouse. He haunted possibility. The idea that somewhere, someone has a folder that ends your career. That's not law, that's psychology." And maybe that was Roy's real innovation, replacing the threat of conviction with the threat of reminder. Because in his world, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about preservation, of control, of secrets, of files. There's something about Roy Cohn's name that makes rooms quieter. Even now, well into the 21st century, you can see it happen. In law schools, when a professor mentions that era, students straighten their backs. In city council chambers, when someone brings up cone-style pressure, aides glance at each other, subtly, as if someone nearby might still have a connection. And in courtrooms, especially those with long benches and older judges, the mere mention of Roy can cause a silence that feels tactical. It's not nostalgia, it's nervous reverence. And part of that nervousness is rooted in something few people like to admit. Roy Cohn never really needed the system. He used it, dressed in its language, filed its motions, walked its halls, but he was never of it. And that, even now, is what unsettles people, because he showed others what it looked like to weaponize civility. He taught a generation how to turn lawsuits into hand grenades and how to smile through scandal like it was scheduled. Historical fact? In 2003, a federal judge cited Cohn's litigation tactics, specifically his intentional burdening of the court, when handing down a decision in a civil suit related to SLAP, strategic lawsuit against public participation. Though Roy had been dead for 17 years, his methods were still shaping modern case law. That ruling became precedent. He'd have liked that. Meanwhile, the city around his memory kept mutating. Midtown grew shinier. Court buildings installed metal detectors. People started storing files in clouds instead of cabinets. But the human game? That stayed the same. The whispered favors, the veiled threats, the hand on the shoulder that means, I know where your skeletons are buried, and who helped dig the hole. Roy's name became shorthand. You're pulling a Cohn, someone would say, when a legal brief was filed, not to win, but to stall. Or, she's got Roy's filing cabinet, when someone mysteriously had dirt no one else could find. Even fictional characters, on cable shows and thrillers, started to sound like him. Confident, clipped, always holding the card no one else knows is in play. It became part of the culture, and yet not everyone remembered the man. Some only knew the outline, the silhouette. A legend passed around by people too young to have watched the hearings, too far removed to know the smell of that courthouse air. And so, as always happens, the myth grew taller than the man who made it. But Roy, even in memory, refused to become benign. You want an example? In 2008, an investigative reporter digging into an old zoning scandal came across a name buried deep in the planning documents, listed only as consultant. The trail led back to a shell firm. And the shell firm's incorporation papers? They bore a signature from 1984, Roy's. It was never proven that the firm was his, but the paper trail was just messy enough to suggest he wanted it that way. A fingerprint smudged just enough to spark curiosity, but not clarity. Many people still think that Roy left dozens, if not hundreds, of echo entities behind. Paper companies, aliases, silent partnerships. Not for money, for influence. So what do you think? Is it paranoia to imagine his structures still operating? Or just acknowledging that the man built his life to outlast his breath? Because Roy didn't believe in endings. He believed in residual effect. You shut the door, but the cold draft remains. You throw away the file, but someone remembers what it said. And in certain political circles, his name resurfaced again, quietly. Usually at the end of a sentence that began with, "You know what we need right now?" The answer, whispered like a prayer or a curse. A Roy, a fixer, a denier, a knife you could fold into a briefcase. The irony, of course, is that the real Roy would have hated being invoked by amateurs. He had no patience for the clumsy, for those who threatened first and thought later, for those who couldn't tell the difference between intimidation and calculation, because Roy never raised his voice unless he'd already removed your exits. He wasn't flashy, he was final. And if you were lucky enough, or unlucky enough to sit across from him, you didn't leave the meeting with answers. You left with a knot in your stomach and a vague suspicion that your secrets had already been indexed. That's the other thing people forgot. He didn't just keep files, he memorized them. Page numbers, margin notes, the angle of a paperclip. If he referenced your file in conversation, you could be sure he wasn't bluffing. That kind of detail, that unnerving intimacy with people's private cracks, left a residue in the city, a layer of discomfort baked into the marble of court buildings and the linoleum of city offices. Today, interns pass the stories around like campfire tales about the lawyer who knew everything, who smiled without joy, who destroyed reputations before lunch and never got a parking ticket. They whisper because they want to believe it's all exaggerated, but somewhere, deep down, they know. Someone like that existed. And the files, even if they're gone, the fear of them isn't. And maybe that was always the point. There's a peculiar weight to a name like Roy Cohn, one that doesn't fade, only shifts. By the 2010s, his story had become less biography and more architecture, woven into the scaffolding of power across industries, still supporting people who had long since stopped mentioning him out loud. But if you looked closely, the signs were everywhere. A federal inquiry abruptly halted with no explanation. A major defamation suit, seemingly bulletproof, folded overnight after the plaintiff's financials were leaked. Accurately, anonymously. A whistleblower's sworn affidavit withdrawn before it could see daylight, citing personal reasons. None of these stories made page one. That wasn't Roy's style, but they followed a pattern. And for those who knew what to look for, they bore a familiar fingerprint. Not ink, but intent. Roy's true gift was never in the courtroom. It was in timing, in understanding that truth, left alone, was just a story waiting for better narration. And in this new world of 24-hour news cycles and digital trails, he would have thrived. Historical fact? In 2017, while covering political influence in Manhattan real estate, a journalist for The Atlantic wrote a retrospective titled, "Roy Cohn Never Left This Town." The article outlined how many of his former clients, protégés, and imitators were still shaping public policy, election strategy, and courtroom tone, sometimes quoting him word for word without attribution. He was gone, but not absent. Many people still think the post-Cohn era is less about replacing him and more about chasing his blueprint. So what do you think? Is it possible to erase a man who trained people to be erasers themselves? Because that's the paradox Roy engineered. He made himself indispensable by making himself reproducible. Every modern fixer owes him a nod. Every behind-the-scenes operator who knows how to kill a headline, redirect a deposition, or leak an unverified document with surgical ambiguity. They are all walking case studies in Cohnist mechanics. Even now, the legal playbook still has his chapters, unlabeled but quoted. Never sue alone. Bury them in cross claims. Never defend yourself. Attack first. If the press is watching, you're already halfway to a win. These rules, passed hand to hand, mentor to protege, have outlived the man who wrote them. And Roy? He'd be proud. Not because people remembered him, but because they couldn't forget the results. Then came the tape, unverified, undated. A short audio clip posted anonymously on a legal blog. It featured a male voice, raspy, deliberate, reading from what sounded like a deposition memo. Then a pause. Then, if you want to ruin a man, don't find what he did. Find what he was afraid to admit. The blog was taken down within days. The clip vanished. But not before dozens of attorneys downloaded it and passed it among themselves. Some said it was fake. Others said it didn't matter, because whether it was Roy or not, It sounded like something he'd say, and that was enough. The mythology of Roy had become so potent, so ambient, that it no longer needed facts to sustain it. Just presence. Just the idea that in some drawer, somewhere, something with your name on it still sat waiting to be weaponized. That's why his name still haunts the gray space between legality and power. Not the courtroom, the corridor outside it. Not the law firm, the private table in the back of the restaurant where judges drink under assumed names. Not the testimony, the pause before the witness speaks. Because Roy understood what so many powerful people forget. The law doesn't need to be broken to be bypassed. And bypassing it, that was his art. In 2019, a political strategist, well-known, rarely quoted, was asked in an off-record interview what his biggest asset was during a scandal-plagued election season. He smiled and said, "I learned from someone who learned from Roy. That's all I'll say." Then he walked away, hands in his pockets, whistling. Roy would have hated the humility, but he would have loved the strategy. Because the ultimate test of influence isn't whether people remember your face. It's whether they fear your fingerprints, even when they're not sure they're there. So if you're wondering how long a shadow Roy Cohn casts, walk into any room where deals are struck without contracts, where silence costs more than speaking, where a man nods once and everyone at the table knows the threat is already filed. That's where he lives now, not in a headline, in a hesitation. By the early 2020s, Roy Cohn's presence in American power structures had evolved into something deeper than influence. It had become infrastructure. It wasn't that people were quoting him anymore. They didn't need to. His instincts had been coded into the operating systems of entire institutions. He was the ghost in the machine, smirking behind boilerplate legalese, lounging somewhere between a cease and desist and an off-the-record phone call. And the irony, in an age where transparency had become a buzzword, Roy's opacity had never looked more modern. Journalists started noticing, not in articles, but in the way their sources went quiet, in the sudden, unexplained pivots in court cases, in the corporate lawsuits filed as warnings, not claims. They saw Roy's hand not because it was visible, but because it wasn't. The phrase Cohn file entered newsroom slang. It didn't mean a case file. It meant the folder you kept on someone just in case they ever turned on you. Historical fact. In 2022, a political watchdog group released an investigation showing that over a dozen major corporations maintained contingency files on regulators, local politicians, and legal adversaries. None of them admitted to using them. None denied they existed. And the origin of the practice? According to one anonymous compliance officer, it goes back to Roy. He taught people that keeping information wasn't about curiosity. It was about leverage. He'd never served as general counsel at any Fortune 500 company, but his mindset had. In courtrooms, younger litigators, born after his death, were employing his playbook with eerie precision. They understood that sometimes the best move wasn't to file, but to leak the intention of filing. That the best evidence wasn't proof, it was pressure. One such lawyer was profiled in a magazine piece titled "The New Roys." The article never mentioned Roy Cohn by name until the final paragraph, where the subject laughed and said, "I didn't invent this. I just inherited the instinct." And in a way, that instinct had become Roy's most durable legacy, because for all his brashness, all his scandal, Roy never tried to control the whole board. He just moved first, filed early, anticipated your angle before you realized you had one. He wasn't playing chess. He was stealing the rule book. But even now, with his name more legend than reality, Roy occasionally surfaced, always obliquely. Like in 2023, when a prominent real estate developer was asked, on live television, who he trusted most with his legal strategy. The man smiled and said, I trust someone who learned from the guy who taught Trump how to handle lawyers. Everyone watching knew what he meant. He didn't have to say it. That's Roy's final victory, being unspoken and unmistakable. Many people still think Roy Cohn's most powerful years were after his death. So what do you think? Is that absurd? Or exactly how he designed it? Because here's the truth no one likes to admit. The files were never the point. Yes, Roy kept them. Yes, he read them. Yes, he probably had things in drawers that could have ended careers before lunch. But the real genius wasn't in what was written. It was in what people believed might be written. Fear didn't come from the folder. It came from the possibility of a folder. That's why people paused when his name came up. That's why judges recused themselves from cases where he'd been involved years after he was gone. That's why law firms still teach mock cases based on a certain mid-century fixer. And that's why, late one night in 2024, a young staffer at a major lobbying firm pulled a file labeled Old NYC MISC from a forgotten cabinet and found a note, dated 1985, typed, no letterhead, no signature, just 3 sentences. If they ask about me, tell them I never met you. If they threaten you, tell them I said to go ahead. If they panic, tell them I still have the copy. No one knows who it was written for or why it was kept, but they didn't throw it away. They filed it under legacy and locked the drawer. You'd think, after decades of silence, the name Roy Cohn would finally recede into dust, shelved alongside other infamous relics of American legal history. But that's not how Roy built things. He didn't build for attention. He built for longevity. And that's why, in 2025, you can still feel him in places he never physically walked. He's there in the waiting room of a high-rise law firm, where a junior partner is quietly advised not to email sensitive strategy. Put it on paper, hand it off, like Roy used to. He's there in a back-channel call between a political consultant and a tabloid editor, where the subject isn't truth, but timing. He's in the whisper that follows the phrase, let's hold off on filing, make them sweat first. Because even now, Cohn's gospel is not about law. It's about human pressure points, historical fact. In 2025, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a legal historian surfaced an FBI memo from 1983. The memo described Roy Cohn not as a legal threat or a suspect, but as a strategic concern in the information chain. The memo's language wasn't accusatory, it was cautious. They weren't afraid of what he'd done. They were afraid of what he knew. That phrasing, decades later, reads like prophecy, because Roy had stopped chasing outcomes long before he was disbarred. He'd already figured it out. Information doesn't expire. Fear doesn't get old. And those two things, they outlive everything. In early 2025, a documentary surfaces, titled Roy, the Lawyer Who Never Left. It's slick, moody, built for streaming. The trailer features dimly lit shots of manila folders, slow zooms on redacted pages, and audio clips that might be Roy, might not. It's a hit, but it misses the point, because Roy wouldn't have wanted a retrospective. He would have wanted a cameo, a line dropped mid-conversation, a name scribbled in the margin, a moment where someone pauses mid-sentence and rethinks their next move. He wouldn't want to be admired. He'd want to be anticipated. Many people still think his greatest strength was legal brilliance. But those who knew him, and those who still operate like him, know better. Roy's real brilliance was unsettling continuity. He never warned you when he was done. He just stopped showing up and made you wonder why. There's a story from early 2025, quiet, unconfirmed. A senior political aide is cleaning out an inherited office drawer in Washington. Behind some outdated budget documents, he finds a slim, sealed envelope with a yellowing label. For when they ask. Inside, 3 names. No explanation, no dates, just a post-it attached. This should still work. R. The aide puts the envelope in a shred pile, then moves it to a locked drawer instead, because no one shreds a message from Roy. Not really. Later that year, a high-stakes court case collapses after a last-minute recusal. A judge, citing emerging conflict issues, steps aside. No one says why, but one reporter, half drunk at a bar in Tribeca, mutters, "Must have been a Cohn file somewhere." Everyone laughs, then stops. The silence after the joke is the part that matters, because Roy's real legacy isn't carved into buildings, it's felt in hunches. In moments where someone chooses not to speak, not to file, not to dig deeper. He taught the system how to doubt itself, and that may be the most effective form of control. You want to know the final proof? Every few years, someone still tries to find the last file, the one people swear he kept on the people no one dared cross, but no one ever finds it. And maybe that's because it never existed, or maybe Roy mailed it to someone with instructions and a promise. If this opens, something's already gone wrong. There's a difference between being remembered and being used. Roy Cohn understood that better than anyone. By 2026, almost 40 years since his death, his name no longer just pops up in footnotes or throwback scandals. Instead, it appears as a strategy line item, subtly embedded in legal templates, communications memos, crisis playbooks. You won't find it in bold, but it's there. Corporate law firms use euphemisms like preemptive narrative construction or offensive litigation planning. What they really mean is pull a Roy, hit first, control the language, make defense look like defeat before the other side can file a motion. His name floats in politics too, not in endorsements, but in behavior. When a candidate dodges an indictment by reframing the narrative around the prosecution's bias, when an advisor stages a press leak to bury another, when a billionaire attacks a regulator instead of answering a subpoena, that's the method in motion. Roy didn't write a rulebook. He wrote instinct into the marrow of American power, historical fact. In 2026, a leaked internal memo from a major Silicon Valley PR and legal advisory firm included a legacy playbook file listing historic legal strategies from past power brokers. The top name, R.M. Cohn. The contents, unclear. But the firm's response to the leak was telling. No comment. That silence. Vintage Roy. Many people still think that invoking Roy is too dated, too dangerous. But others, especially those under pressure, know better. So what do you think? Does the man live on in name or in outcome? Because here's the truth no one says aloud. You don't need to agree with Roy to emulate him. That's the real trick. He never needed followers. He just needed patterns to survive him. Patterns like this. Build the file before the friendship. Talk last, but know everything by the time you do. Let others leak for you. Never use the sharpest knife first. Keep something back. Always. You hear echoes of that in the way modern deals are closed, with fewer signatures and more leverage points. In the way negotiations are preceded not by opening offers, but by whispers about past errors that could surface. In the way public relations firms keep just-in-case folders on potential crises, sometimes before their clients are even aware of the risk. This isn't paranoia. It's Roy's blueprint for survival, and it's spreading. The newest lawyers, the fresh out of law school crowd, rarely know Roy by name, but they feel him in the way their senior partners steer around truth to arrive at advantage, in the way they're taught to argue not for justice, but for narrative traction. One law school ethics professor recently surveyed students on undue influence in historical legal cases. Nearly half cited a quote attributed to Roy Cohn. The problem? He never said it, but the words felt like his. And in Roy's world, that was enough, because he knew perception outlives attribution. Then something unexpected, a high-profile figure. Once a Roy client dies, his estate includes a sealed vault of legal materials. And among the items, there's a cassette, labeled in typewriter font, October, Riverside, R. It's a voice memo, just under 3 minutes. Roy's voice. The tape begins mid-sentence. E. And if they say anything, just remind them how long I've been quiet. Quiet means I'm still thinking, still watching. Quiet means there's more than one version of the truth. Mine just hasn't been priced yet. Then a click, then silence. The tape makes its way online, briefly. It's taken down within 24 hours, but not before it's downloaded, clipped, filed, added to a new kind of drawer. The digital kind, because Roy's world, folders, safes, whispers, has gone virtual now. But the logic is the same. Someone, somewhere, always has the file. And if they don't, they want you to believe they do. That's where Roy Cohn still lives. In the pause before someone speaks too freely. In the hesitation before someone testifies. In the second look, someone gives a closed drawer before they leave the room. Not present, but never fully gone. It's almost poetic, in a noir sort of way, that the further Roy Cohn fades from the living memory of America, the clearer his methods become. By 2027, Roy's name no longer dominates conversations. It haunts their margins. He's not quoted. He's implied. His shadow stretches across courtrooms, newsrooms, war rooms. And if you listen closely, if you really lean in, you'll notice that the people who operate the most like Roy are the ones who never say his name, because they don't have to. They know. Invoking Roy is redundant if you're doing it right. It shows up in how documents are worded, bland on the surface, with barbed wire buried in the footnotes. It's in how meetings are scheduled at the last possible minute, giving opponents no time to prepare. It's in how the narrative gets changed not in court, but in a headline that lands 1 hour before the morning talk shows. It's all Roy, even if the young ones think they invented it. Historical fact. In 2027, a whistleblower case against a major pharmaceutical company collapses after key documents are ruled inadmissible. The reason? A procedural technicality that hadn't been cited since a 1979 federal case, argued by Roy Cohn. A coincidence? Probably not, because Roy never aimed for popularity. He aimed for durability, and he got it. The legal system, bloated, delayed, permanently in a tug of war with itself, still shows signs of his blueprint. Lawyers file motions with no intention of arguing them. Publicists release statements that sound legally rehearsed. Threats are never direct anymore. They come cloaked in professionalism. We'd prefer to settle this quietly. We trust this matter can be resolved without unnecessary scrutiny. We'd hate to escalate unnecessarily. All of it Cohn speak. All of it code for leverage. And what's more fascinating, Roy's legacy isn't just in the powerful, it's in the nervous. Because today, even average people, bloggers, activists, whistleblowers, know the term Cohn-style retaliation. It means the sudden, coordinated response to dissent. A legal letter, a sudden audit, a digital smear campaign, or worse, a silence too organized to be accidental. And that silence? It's his music. Many people still think Roy Cohn's techniques were only relevant to a different era, when typewriters clicked and courtrooms smelled like tobacco. But so what do you think? Has time softened the man, or just sharpened the methods he left behind? Because in 2027, information is faster, but doubt is still the most efficient weapon. And Roy understood that. The fear of exposure remains more powerful than the exposure itself. You want proof? Ask any executive who's pulled their name off a press release at the last minute. Ask any politician who's suddenly reconsidered their vote. Ask any billionaire who's quietly settled a lawsuit with no admission of wrongdoing and a gag order longer than the Constitution. That's the Roy effect. Subtle, chilling, effective. And then there's the curious case of the Roy papers. A collector, anonymous of course, claims to have purchased a collection of Cohn's personal effects at a private estate auction. Included were an engraved lighter, supposedly a gift from J. Edgar Hoover, a Rolodex with dozens of redacted names, and a folder labeled simply unopened. Let them wonder. It's not the contents that matter. It's the existence, the idea that there's still more, that Roy even now is holding out. Because that was the game, not proof, possibility. He knew that when you create a trail with just enough breadcrumbs to keep people nervous, they'll walk themselves into paranoia without you ever needing to speak. And maybe that's the last real truth about Roy. He didn't want to be known. He wanted to be felt. In the unease, in the hesitation, in the moment just before someone answers a question they shouldn't. And for that reason, whether you're holding a deposition, signing a settlement, or simply whispering in a hallway, Roy Cohn is still here. Not in the room, but right outside it. By 2028, Roy Cohn's name has morphed into something strange. Less a person, more a warning label. For those climbing the ladders of law, politics, and media, it's a label that reads, "Use with caution, potent." Residual effects may apply. He's not cited in lectures. He's glanced at, not praised, not condemned, just nodded toward. Like a story everyone knows, but no one finishes. Because by now, everyone has their own version of Roy. To some, he's the ultimate fixer, brilliant, brutal, and utterly indispensable. To others, he's a cautionary tale about ambition without restraint. And to a growing few, especially those inheriting the systems he once cracked open, he's a template for post-truth power. Because Roy never cared who believed him. He cared who acted like he might be right. Historical fact? In 2028, a major federal oversight committee issued a report on judicial intimidation tactics in high-profile lobbying cases. One section, tucked in a footnote, referenced legacy legal strategies from disbarred practitioners. The only name mentioned, Roy M. Cohn. The language was dry. The implication wasn't, and that's how it usually goes. No headlines, just shadows. Yet even in those shadows, Roy's style is evolving. His once paper-heavy world, manila folders, yellow legal pads, hand-marked transcripts, has given way to encrypted drives, digital breadcrumbs, algorithms built to auto-scrub timelines. But the goals remain the same. Delay until disinterest, deny until confusion, discredit until retreat. One could argue Roy would have loved the modern digital age. Not for the technology, but for the speed of manipulatable perception. In his time, you had to wait for the morning paper. Now, one well-timed post, and the facts are buried beneath 1,000 doubts. And you better believe someone like Roy would have kept his own burner phone archive, would have had a Google alert on your regret. Many people still think we're overdue for a full reckoning with Roy Cohn's influence, but others argue we're living in it. So what do you think? Is his era past, or is the era finally catching up to him? Because across industries, his thinking still lives. Not in mission statements, but in behaviors. A tech CEO who buries bad news under a celebrity lawsuit, Cohn playbook. A politician who sues a journalist not for truth, but to signal power, Cohn again. A lawyer who leaks partial transcripts to twist public opinion while the judge is still deliberating? Absolutely, Roy. And here's the terrifying beauty of it all. Roy never needed to be imitated accurately. He just needed the echo, and the echo has grown louder. Then another ripple. An old friend of Roy's, a man now in his late 80s, long retired, gives an interview to a little-watched podcast. Just an old lawyer sharing war stories. Near the end, the host asks, "What do you think Roy would say about today's legal world?" The man chuckles softly and replies, he'd say, "They're not doing it wrong. They're just doing it without me." The episode goes viral. People start quoting the line in court blogs, on legal Twitter, even in the sidebar of a legal thriller's book jacket. Roy, once again, returns via implication, and perhaps the most telling proof, In a recent poll of high-powered legal professionals, 38% admitted to keeping non-legal notes on their opposing counsel. When asked where they learned to do that, one response read, "It's common sense. You never know when you'll need a Roy move." A Roy move, not a strategy, not a brief, a move. Because that's the part that remains the most dangerous. Roy Cohn didn't give people policies. He gave them permission to cut deeper, to play dirtier, to hide the knife in the handshake. And now, even as the world tries to pretend it's more transparent, more ethical, more evolved, somewhere, someone is reaching for that old drawer, not because they need to win, but because they need to remind that even silence can file motions, that even ghosts keep records, that even now, Roy Cohn is waiting. You'd think by now, Roy Cohn would finally be still. After all, he's had nearly 4 decades underground. Time enough for obituaries to grow stale, for his name to sink beneath newer scandals, for his legacy to settle into footnotes. But Roy, being Roy, doesn't fade. He recalibrates. He lingers, and in 2029, the world he once manipulated seems to have grown into his mold. The courtroom isn't just a venue now. It's a stage, a chessboard, a sound chamber. Law is still practiced, yes, but narrative? That's the new weapon. Perception is the battleground, and reputation management firms operate with as much budget and muscle as a legal counsel, which, if you know your Roy, is exactly what he predicted, because Roy didn't believe in winning cases. He believed in defining them before they started. Historical fact. In 2029, a scandal emerges involving a political campaign hiring a private consulting firm to prepare anticipatory litigation, targeting potential accusers months before any public incident occurred. A whistleblower reveals internal documents labeling the tactic as proactive Cohn protocol, not even subtle anymore. And yet, somewhere between that ugly genius and the cold calculation, there's still a strange quiet around Roy. You won't find his image framed on the walls of courthouses. No statue in Foley Square. No law school building bears his name. But try asking 10 lawyers in Midtown if they've ever read about him. Every single one will nod. They won't say it out loud, but they know. Roy's not past tense. He's just rebranded. A mindset, a reflex, a strategic murmur. You see it in the way settlements now come with layered NDAs. Some of them so dense they need their own legal teams. You see it in the way corporations handle whistleblowers. Never head on. Always obliquely, silently, effectively. You see it in the way influence is bought, not in cash, but in mutual risk. A trick Roy turned into high art, because Roy understood something elemental about human behavior. People fear memory more than punishment. If you're fined, you heal. If you're imprisoned, the sentence ends. But if someone remembers something that never quite goes away, that's leverage. That's Roy. Many people still think Roy Cohn was just a product of his time. A Cold War pit bull, a McCarthy-era relic. But what if he was something else? A preview, an early draft of how future power would operate, not through declarations, but implications. Not by breaking the law, but by bending it until the scream turns into a whisper. So what do you think? Was he ahead of his time? Or was time just catching up to him? A final whisper then, from the archives, a handwritten note, discovered tucked inside a hollow book during the remodeling of an old Manhattan law firm once connected to Roy's network. No letterhead, just a slanted script. The secret isn't what you know. The secret is who thinks you know it, and whether they sleep well after. Underneath, in smaller handwriting, P.S. I never throw anything away. You never know when a file becomes a favor. The note is framed now, quietly, behind the receptionist's desk at that same law firm. No one mentions it to clients, but everyone who works there knows it by heart, because the truth is, Roy Cohn never really needed a monument. He built himself into the architecture. He's the reason some lawyers lock their drawers before leaving for lunch. He's the reason some judges don't answer certain calls on the first ring. He's the reason a few people, powerful, careful, aging, still flinch at the sound of a manila folder sliding open behind them. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not fear, not respect, but stillness. That eerie knowing stillness that comes when you realize someone, somewhere might still have the file, and it just might have your name on it. So, if you're still with me, breathing gently now, let's slow everything down. Let the air in the room soften, the edges of each thought blur. Let Roy Cohn's name drift, just a little, into the distance. Less a person now, more a silhouette, walking off into the fog of your imagination. No footsteps, just suggestion, because that's how his story was always meant to end. Not with thunder, but with a whisper you couldn't quite place. We've walked through backrooms and boardrooms, through faded memos and half-buried rumors, through a city still echoing with choices he made long ago. But that's all in the past now. Let it settle. Close the drawer in your mind where the just-in-case files are kept. Let the courtroom doors creak closed behind you. And breathe. You're not in Midtown anymore. You're here, quiet, unbothered, letting the hum of a fan or the comfort of a dark room take over. Let the tension that once lined your shoulders ease its grip. Let your thoughts go quiet, like papers sliding back into place. And in that quiet, you'll find something Roy Cohn never chased. Rest, not silence out of fear, but calm out of release. So sleep easy now. The lights are low, the files are closed, and the night belongs to your peace.